Over the years, I've talked bits and pieces about the Gnome history, like how Gnome initially stole the thunder that KDE had, primarily because Qt at the time was under a proprietary license, and why Gnome split from the GNU project, even though originally it was the GNU Networked Object Model environment. But recently, I was sent this post, the story of the Gnome project. This is an archive from 2013, but the post is considerably older, from probably, judging by the archive, 2001, but it might be even older than that. Even though this is a really old post, there is something that caught my attention. Firstly is the site this was done on, that being Simian.com, and the author, Miguel. Why do those matter? Well, if you know some of your early GNOME history, they might ring a bell. Simian initially began as international GNOME support before becoming Helix Code, and then being acquired by Novell in 2003, the same Novell that acquired SUSE, and also at one point owned the Unix trademark. This was a company created for the sole purpose of supporting GNOME development back in the very, very early days of the project. They created Simian Evolution, which later became GNOME Evolution, and also started the Mono project. Simian was started by Nat Friedman and Miguel de Icaza. Nat Friedman is now a former GNOME Foundation chair, a former GitHub CEO, and now running Meta's Superintelligence Labs. Miguel de Icaza, alongside Federico Menaquintero, created the GNOME project. So with this being on the Simian website, written by Miguel, there is no better person to explain the very early days of the project. So let us get right into it with the foundations of the GNOME project. 30 years ago in 1996, my friend Elliot Lee was working at Red Hat for a summer as the webmaster. There is an Elliot Lee still involved in Fedora. I don't know if it's the same person. We shared a lot of common interests related to the future of free software. We both contributed to various efforts to bring free software forward. After the introduction of Windows 95, it was clear that the free software universe was lacking a number of technologies and that we were lagging behind in various areas. I did some work into a free implementation of Java AWT. God, that is something I've not thought about in a long time, because back in those days, Java was still seen as the solution for the lack of software in Unix systems. It runs on 7 trillion devices, so obviously Java was the solution. Java was very, very big back in the 90s. It's still really big today, but it was the, mainstream hyped up language like Rust is today. At the time, I was working with Ralph Bachel in the Linux/SGI port that was partially funded by SGI. From time to time, I would devote a few hours to other free software efforts that would help close the gap between proprietary offerings and Linux. My friend Ariel Fagon at SGI had once raised the issues of the future of free software and the lack of desktop applications and the lack of an OLE-like model. OLE is basically a inter-process communication system that was being used on Windows. Eventually, something did come along that did effectively this. That was dbus. Elliot and I tried to organize various efforts to address some of the inconsistency issues in Linux. Our first attempt was the libapp effort, which was a set of library functions that would be used to access common resources used by applications, configuration management, keeping track of recently used files, MIME handling, and so on. But we never did quite finish the project. At this time, the idea of producing a complete system like GNOME was out of the question, and we were aiming for the easy tasks first. In 1996, I recruited 2 students from the recently created computer science degree at UNAM. Those students were Arturo Espinoza and Federico Mena. They were working on assorted free software projects and in projects around my favorite language at the time, Scheme. They worked with me in free software and in fun projects at the Instituto de... I'm not even going to try that, at this place here in Mexico. There we also worked on the Mexican Linux user group. In the summer of 1997, my friend Randy Chapman invited me to interview at the Microsoft Internet Explorer for Solaris on the Spark because of my background in the Linux/Spark port. I went to interview at Microsoft that summer and met both Randy Chapman and Nat Friedman for the first time in person, having known them for quite a long time on the LinuxNet IRC network. At Microsoft, I learned the truth about ActiveX and COM, and I got very interested in it immediately. Upon my return to Mexico, Federico and I started to design a GUI control infrastructure for Unix that we codenamed Gnome. He was working as the maintainer of GIMP back then, and our efforts were targeted towards its adoption on TK at the time. TK was the toolkit it was using. GTK wasn't a thing yet. This project was the seed for what later became the Bonobo component architecture. 16 months would pass before I started working on Bonobo. Bonobo was a now scrapped attempt at building an OLE-like model for Linux. It was used up until GNOME 2.4 before being replaced with dbus and Geo from glib. At this point, KDE, the cool desktop environment project, was showing a lot of promise. A team of programmers started an effort to bring Unix to the desktop using the C++-based GUI toolkit. I emailed my friend Eric Trone, suggesting him to include that code into the Red Hat distribution. That actually did happen for a period. Eventually, KDE was removed for a number of reasons, mostly about KDE having a very wonky release model at the time. And I mailed Richard Stallman to let him know that this is an interesting project that existed. KDE was licensed under the terms of the GNU GPL. I got a reply back from both Eric and Richard pointing out the KDE dependency on Qt resulted in a piece of non-free software. Qt did not give end users the right to modify, redistribute, nor distribute modified copies of the code and violated the terms of the GNU GPL. At the time, this was a massive deal. The free software movement, the FSF, GNU, was a lot stronger in Linux, and basically, if you didn't support that, you likely were not using Linux. Nowadays, it's more of a pragmatic, open source approach. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is not really the point here. It's just back then, there was a lot more strength in that free software approach. This was a big part of the reason why GNOME got a lot of attention when it came along, because it was under a GPL toolkit, it was a GPL desktop, it didn't have that same issue that Qt had at the time. Since then, that problem has been dealt with, but every so often someone is reminded about it and is like, hey guys, did you know Qt's proprietary? As if we're still in like 2003, and people don't know that things have changed since then. Plus, the software industry has changed massively since then, and the idea of Qt going back on this just doesn't really make any sense. Being a free software enthusiast, I contacted Trolltech, the authors of Qt, to propose an alternative licensing scheme for Qt that would still allow them to build a company while empowering users, but got no reply. The Trolltech FAQ at the time also contained significant errors regarding the GPL and ignored dual licensing schemes. After a timeout period, we decided to do something about this problem. Also discouraging was the fact that KDE developers were not interested in resolving those issues, as pointed out in the FAQ document and their mailing list policies. Again, this is a problem which has long since been resolved. I believe since 2012, it's been fully resolved, and then 2016, they came out and made another statement basically saying, we are committed to always having this be open. If you're curious about that, check out the KDE Free Qt Foundation. This has links out to everything that is relevant and basically goes over the license agreements made between the owners of Qt and the KDE project, and how if at any point they're like, we're done with doing this, the code will just be handed over to KDE. We evaluated writing a free Qt replacement, but implementing an API would likely result in less efficient software and would have taken too long to implement. GNU Step, Wine, and LessTif were other projects that had attempted to re-implement a proprietary API and just had a limited success after a long development history. It is funny to see Wine mentioned as not succeeding. This was written many, many years ago, because at this point, it is the foundation that Valve relies on for doing Linux gaming. All of this so far was before the creation of the GNOME desktop. So, GNOME is born. Update. We did try for a few days to work on the GNU Step project. Francisco Bustamante? I think? Federico and I would be working on getting the whole thing to work, but it was too big, too slow, too buggy, too incomplete, and there was little organization in the team. After repeated attempts to work on it, we eventually gave up. So, GNU Step is a very interesting project. This was a re-implementation of NextStep, the operating system and interface made by the company that Steve Jobs started after getting kicked out of Apple, and then was eventually bought again by Apple. Whilst it might look really old now, really weird, and not something you would actually go and use yourself, this was a revolutionary interface, and a lot of the features that you rely on today was started by this system. So I started the Gnome project in August of 1997. The draft for the announcement was sent to various friends of mine, which included Richard Stallman, Mark Ewing, Elliot Lee, Eric Trone, Spencer Kimball, and Peter Mathis. When the project was ready, Federico and I sent the announcement of the creation of the Gnome project to a few mailing lists: the GIMP mailing list, the Gilly mailing list, the GNU project announcer mailing list, and comp.os.linux.announce, which is effectively the Linux mailing list of the time. Federico and I started developing the GNOME libraries on our spare time. He was still mostly working on the GIMP. Again, this is how you know this is an old post on the GIMP. That was the official naming of GIMP at the time. And I was still mostly working on X11 IRIX emulation code for Linux on the SGI Indie. Various early contributions from the people on the mailing list just had a long-lasting effect. Cobra was going to be our foundation for the component architecture, and DocBook would be used to write documentation of GNOME. Initially, we looked into Xerox's ILU, but the license of it was not free, so we had to research other options. We tried Miko for some time, but it was too large and slow for most developers and users. Then we looked at Flix optimizing compiler, and finally Dick and Elliot would start work on it. At this point, a friend of ours registered gnome.org and offered to host the CVS server for GNOME. Again, this is well pre-Git being a thing. By November that year, GNOME had reached enough momentum that both Federico and I dropped other projects and voted ourselves completely to work on GNOME. We had a meeting the early days of December with Mark Ewing and Dr. Mike at the Red Hat offices. To make this meeting, I had to skip the U2 concert in Mexico City for their pop tour. I remember that they were transmitting the concert live on satellite TV, but Eric took me dancing. Mark was creating the Red Hat Advanced Development Labs, which would be the first funded team of developers that would work towards improving GNOME. This lab was created in January of 1998. Mark and Dr. Mike worked on the GNOME help browser, Raster worked on GTK IMlib, Enlightenment, and the GTK Plus themes engine. Later that year, Owen, Jonathan, Dave, and Federico would join. Then it was time to demo the project at Linux Expo being hosted at Duke University. This is also the first time I did a presentation on the GNOME project, which turned out okay, despite the problems I had with my laptop on stage. Doesn't matter how much time passes, some things never change. This was also the first time I saw Nat Friedman after having met him at Microsoft, and it was a lot of fun. He was working on a more extensible Dingus architecture for various terminal programs. The Dingus click feature would eventually make it into GNOME Terminal and prove to be a necessary feature for everything that pretended to be a terminal emulator. Now you might be asking, what the hell is a Dingus architecture and a Dingus click? Well, here is a terminal, and let's say I have this link right here. I can click on that link. That act of clicking on a link in a terminal, that's a Dingus click. Why, you may be asking, is it a Dingus click? I don't know, but maybe that is a topic for another video. This right here, this is the main reason I wanted to talk about this blog post. The GNOME logo. Where did the logo come from? Why is it afoot? Thomas Kuusamanen, I think, probably entirely butchered that, was one of our friends that used to go by the GIMP IRC. Thomas, being a GIMP user himself, did various logos. The GIMP mascot Wilbur, and he also done some small icons that were very nice looking. We started to use Thomas's icons in GNOME, and he would draw icons for us in various GNOME applications, and also for the various stock icons. An idea I had that Eckhart implemented to add some consistency to the look of applications. When we were looking for an icon for the GNOME panel, we went to Thomas's site, and we picked one of the icons he had drawn that had no association to anything yet. A gradient-filled foot in a square. This was the foot that was used for the menu for a long time. That being not this original logo, but the one a little bit before it. This one right here. Now, technically, this was also used, but it wasn't really used as a logo. This little foot here, that was the logo. But the foot turned out to be problematic as someone spotted a similar looking logo, and both Dr. Mike and Rasterman were worried about possible problems caused because our GNOME foot looked similar to the other logo. The Red Hat Labs decided to sponsor a logo competition for GNOME a few months later, and the prize was a digitizing tablet, a drawing tablet, but this is, a long time ago, before that terminology became pretty much standard. There is one drawback to the logo contest. It was run by the GIMP people, and hence one of the requirements was to make the logo using GIMP. This means we did not get any vector-based logos for the project. There were many good submissions, many of them were very good. We chose to use a new version of the foot done by Thomas himself. The biggest difference is the new foot looked like a G instead. The other one was a right foot. This would be a left foot, G-shaped. The logo is quite nice, and we are still using it today. So that logo was this one right here. This was the new logo they had at the time. This eventually did get a pure black version, and then was eventually replaced by the logo we have now. I have been told many, many, many times that this looks like a G. I have looked at it, I've stared at the feet, I have examined the feet, and I have never seen a G. I don't know where the G is supposed to be. I don't know if it's a weird way of writing a G that I don't know about, but I have never looked at this and seen the letter G. All I've seen is foot. And then, a bit over a year ago, this blog post came out from Cassidy James. Gnome should kick the foot to the curb, mostly, which basically argued that the foot should no longer be the primary logo of Gnome, and this created, quite a bit of discourse. This is the end of the blog post here. Everything under this, that's comments. Except, I guess, this little bit at the bottom here for, like, you know, other blog posts this links to. This is all people that are arguing about whether or not the foot is a good logo, whether they should change the foot. Ultimately, the foot never got changed, and it's probably not going to be changed because, well, a lot of the greybeards like the foot and don't really see a problem with it. A lot of the new people don't really care about the foot. There's just like a loud vocal minority that have a problem with it and are like, haha, foot jokes, haha, feet are sexual. And then most of the people just don't really care. Also, there's like a whole legal challenge of changing the logo because it's a trademarked thing, and then it becomes a whole nother mess. Basically, on the list of priorities that Gnome should have, the foot's kind of like in the floor, you know, where feet probably should be. Following this, there's some random stuff about GNOME Calendar, GNOME Merrick, and the Canvas, Federico joining Red Hat Labs, but I'll jump ahead to this bit right here, the QPL. Around November 1998, Trolltech announced their plans to release the upcoming version of Qt 2.0, under a new license that was going to comply with the open source definition. This announcement did actually have two effects. It killed Project Harmony, which was a free clone of the Qt API, and weakened the reason why people would suggest GNOME instead of waiting for the new Qt library. Now, this didn't really have much of an effect for the time. KDE did have many, many rough years in its early days. It's sort of taken until, you know, fairly recently for KDE to rebuild up that reputation. Also, it didn't hurt that GNOME was kind of doing the opposite. The 0.99 code freeze. In November 1998, we started to freeze the code for the GNOME 1.0 release. We broke the freeze a couple times to accommodate the integration of Ralph Levian's work on the GNOME anti-alias canvas. There were various interests mixed here. In one hand, Red Hat was in need of a desktop environment, and in the other hand, various hackers had been working very long hours to make this happen. It would take a lot of discussion to get the anti-alias canvas into the main GNOME distribution. This would delay the release just a bit. And then, March 1999 was the release of GNOME 1.0. It was announced to the world during the Linux World Expo in San Jose, California. This version marked the freeze of the GNOME 1.0 API. This release contained several bugs. The first version of GNOME to ship in a Linux distribution was a derivative of GNOME 1.0 that included various improvements over the plain 1.0. GNOME had been difficult to build and keep up to date, which led to the little testing in 1.0 and gave 1.0 a bad reputation due to its instability. This release included a very basic Cobra support in the panel and a pretty good object activation system, not the best one, but definitely passable. This would be replaced for GNOME 1.4 with OAF. We fixed as many bugs as possible that people were reporting, and we released new packages constantly. It has always been a tradition to release packages with bug fixes as soon as possible. Red Hat shipped version 5.0 of their operating system with GNOME 1.0.xx, which contains a load of bug fixes, but was still very unstable. They also included in this release KDE. Let us jump ahead to guadec. Matthew LeCage organized the GNOME Users and Developers European Conference. Guadec, I actually did not know what it stood for. I don't know if it still stands for that. I don't know, not important. In Paris, France on March 2000, Guadec was initially a small conference to be delivered to the students of France Telecom in Paris by Havoc, Federico, and me. I discussed with Matthew the possibility of getting funding for making Guadec a larger Gnome conference than planned. When he agreed, I started to raise funds from various free software companies in the US and Germany. Matthew did the same with companies and sponsors in France. In the end, we managed to get enough money to fly around 40 of the core Gnome developers to France for 4 days. The Guadec conference was a success. It helped the various Gnome developers to get to know each other. The high bandwidth communication that was made possible between developers, contributors, translators, and documentation contributors at the conference really pushed Gnome forward. A global vision of the project could be expanded to more people, and many things got in sync at this point. The 2 Gnome-based companies, Easel and Helix Code, were represented in the conference. We did miss Elliot Lee though, he could not make it. This conference would be the foundation for the success of Bongo Gnome release later in the year, and this letter was sent to the various sponsors of Guadec. If you'd like to read it, feel free to go and do so. It is just a really long text document, basically just thanking everybody involved. Let us go to the Gnome Foundation. This was announced in August of 2000 at Linux World Expo in San Jose, California. There was an extensive coverage on the news. Various companies joined together to continue development of the GNOME user environment and GNOME-based technologies. After the foundation was announced, a number of initiatives from the founding members were announced. Sun Microsystem adopts GNOME technology for their user environment in Solaris OS. Hewlett-Packard adopts GNOME for their user environment in HPUX operating system. Sun will port their recently open source StarOffice suite to the GTK Plus toolkit and will integrate with the GNOME Bonobo component architecture. IBM contributed the Sash XB rapid development environment to GNOME. GNOME would adopt and integrate Mozilla as part of its desktop strategy, and the GNOME project would adopt open office technologies. Also, Sun created the GNOME Accessibility Lab, which was a big part of the initial push to getting accessibility tech available on Linux. It was kind of the only push for a very long time, and it hasn't been until maybe the past, I would say, 5 or so years that there's been a new concerted effort in making Linux accessible. So I guess hopefully you learned something. Hope you learned something about feet, or maybe GNOME, probably about feet though. Anyway, let me know your thoughts down below. If you liked the video, go like the video, go subscribe as well, go hype the video if you're on mobile, and if you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon scribes, the Libero Pay, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and show me them feet.